In June 1961, the world's most glamorous woman walked into the heart of the British Empire, appearing like a modern-day saint in Givenchy silk. But behind the pearls and the perfect French accent lay a toxic trail of insults that nearly ignited a diplomatic wildfire. Jackie Kennedy called the Queen incurious, and the palace a sad, dilapidated relic. Two icons, one bitter rivalry, and a dinner party that felt more like a battlefield. This is the truth history buried. To understand how two of the most powerful women in the 20th century ended up in a cold war of manners, we have to travel back to the summer of 1961. The world was gripped by Kennedy mania. John F. Kennedy had been in office for barely 4 months, and his wife, Jacqueline, had already become a global obsession. They were the American version of royalty, young, vibrant, and dangerously charming. But as they touched down in London, fresh off a triumphant tour of Paris, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that the cameras never captured. Jackie was at the height of her beauty, but internally, she was a frantic mess of insecurities and contradictions. While the public saw a poised, smiling First Lady, the private Jackie was a woman who chain-smoked in the shadows and bit her nails to the quick. She was haunted by a paralyzing fear of failure, often whispering to Jack in their private moments that she felt like a dud or a disappointment. This paradox defined her. She was a woman of immense intellectual depth and French ancestry, yet she felt like an outsider in the very high society circles she was born to lead. When she arrived at Buckingham Palace, she wasn't just meeting a monarch. She was walking into a mirror of everything she feared she wasn't: stable, traditional, and unshakable. The friction began long before the first handshake, rooted in a messy dispute over the guest list for an unofficial dinner. Jackie wanted her sister, Princess Lee Radziwill, and her husband, Prince Stanislaw, to attend. In the early 1960s, this was a radical request. Both the prince and princess were divorcees, multiple times over. To Queen Elizabeth II, the protector of the Church of England and the dignity of the crown, inviting divorcees to a royal table was not just a breach of protocol, it was an affront to the institution itself. The Queen objected, and in a move that signaled her emerging iron will, Jackie objected to the objection. This wasn't just a spat over seating charts, it was a clash of civilizations. On one side, you had the new frontier of America, where divorce was becoming a social reality and celebrity was the new currency. On the other, you had a 1,000-year-old monarchy that viewed tradition as its only defense against a changing world. The Washington Post would later describe this drama as a silent power struggle where neither woman was willing to blink first. Jackie saw the Queen's hesitation as a personal slight, a plot to do her down before she even stepped foot inside the palace gates. The Queen eventually relented, but she was a master of the passive-aggressive royal snub. While she allowed Jackie's sister to attend, she retaliated by pointedly excluding the very people Jackie actually wanted to meet, the vibrant Princess Margaret and Princess Marina. Instead, the room was filled with what Jackie would later describe as every Commonwealth Minister of Agriculture they could find. It was a calculated move to make the evening as dull as possible for the sophisticated American guest. As the heavy doors of the state dining room swung shut, the stage was set for an evening of forced smiles and whispered daggers. But what Jackie didn't realize was that the Queen had spent her entire life learning how to survive people like her. While Jackie relied on her formidable wardrobe and her command of languages to dazzle, Elizabeth had something far more potent: the ability to remain entirely unimpressed. The First Lady had charmed the legendary Charles de Gaulle into a state of flattery, but the British sovereign was made of much sterner stuff. The collision between Jackie's fragile ego and the Queen's stoic duty was about to produce a review of Buckingham Palace that would leave the royal family reeling for decades. As the silver service clattered softly against fine bone china in the state dining room, the air between the two women was thick with a silence that no amount of diplomatic small talk could fill. Jackie Kennedy sat, draped in her impeccable style, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. To her, the evening wasn't a celebration of the special relationship between Britain and America. It was a psychological endurance test. She felt the Queen's eyes on her, not with admiration, but with a cold, professional curiosity. Jackie would later tell friends that she felt the Queen resented her presence, a feeling of being unwanted that gnawed at the First Lady's already fragile nerves. The conversation was a masterclass in missed connections. At one point, seeking common ground, Jackie spoke to the Queen about the grueling nature of their public lives. She described the sheer exhaustion of her recent tour in Canada, of being on public display for hours until her face ached from smiling. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from the First Lady. The Queen's response was chillingly pragmatic. She looked at Jackie with a conspiratorial glint and simply said, "One gets crafty after a while and learns how to save oneself." To Jackie, this wasn't sisterly advice. It was the mark of a woman who had traded her humanity for a crown. This brief exchange was, according to Jackie's later accounts, the only time the Queen seemed remotely human during the entire night. But even that humanity felt mechanical. While Prince Philip was described as nice but nervous, the bond between the royal couple seemed, in Jackie's eyes, non-existent. She was observing a marriage that was less about romance and more about a shared management of an ancient firm. For a woman like Jackie, who thrived on intellectual spark and romantic intensity, the clinical atmosphere of the palace was suffocating. After the meal, in an attempt to fulfill the duties of a hostess, the Queen invited Jackie for a private tour of the palace's vast art collection. They walked down the long, silent galleries, surrounded by the ghosts of kings and queens past. They stopped in front of a masterpiece by Van Dyck. The Queen, perhaps tired of the heavy diplomatic lifting, pointed to the canvas and remarked, "That is a good horse." Jackie, stunned by the simplicity, or what she perceived as the banality, of the comment, could only reply, "Yes, that is a good horse." For the Queen, it was likely a safe, polite observation to keep the gears of the evening turning. For Jackie, it was the final proof that the woman leading the British Empire was heavy-going and intellectually incurious. She saw the Queen's focus on the animal in the painting as a symptom of a deeper lack of imagination. It was a moment of profound cultural disconnect that would soon bloom into a full-scale verbal assault once Jackie was back on American soil. As the Kennedys finally made their escape from the palace that night, the official record noted a very pleasant evening. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan wrote in his diary that the event was a success, but the smiles for the cameras were a facade. Jackie was already sharpening the knives for a critique that would make the British headlines look like love letters. The world saw a diplomatic triumph, but Jackie was about to reveal the sad, dilapidated truth of what she really saw behind those gilded doors. When the dust settled on the London visit, Jackie Kennedy didn't just hold a grudge. She weaponized it. In the privacy of her social circles, and most famously to the writer Gore Vidal, the First Lady unleashed a critique of the British monarchy that was as devastating as it was personal. This wasn't just a guest complaining about the food. This was an intellectual demolition of an icon. Jackie described Queen Elizabeth as unintelligent, remarkably unremarkable, and heavy-going. For the woman who had captivated Paris with her wit and style, the Queen was the ultimate dud. But Jackie didn't stop at the woman. She went after the house. She described Buckingham Palace not as a grand royal residence, but as a second-rate hotel, dilapidated, sad, and smelling of damp history. To Jackie, the palace wasn't a symbol of power. It was a tired institution that had lost its place in the modern world. She mocked the medieval obeisance she saw others performing around the Queen, finding the pomp and circumstance of the British court to be nothing more than the snobbery of the social climber. It was a Yelp review from hell, delivered with the sting of a Bouvier aristocrat. Why was Jackie so vitriolic? Some historians suggest it was a defense mechanism. Jackie was a woman who lived in constant fear of being misunderstood or looked down upon. By branding the Queen as incurious, Jackie was elevating her own intellectual status. If the Queen was boring, then Jackie was the vibrant, modern alternative. It was a classic mean girl maneuver played out on the highest possible stage. She even took aim at the Queen's appearance, describing her hairstyle and wardrobe as comparatively old-fashioned, a subtle dig at the woman who didn't or wouldn't compete with Jackie's Givenchy glamour. The fallout of these comments was a slow-motion car crash in the world of high society. When Gore Vidal repeated Jackie's heavy-going comment to Princess Margaret years later, the princess didn't deny it. She simply said, "But that's what she's there for." It highlighted the fundamental gap between the two women. Jackie was a celebrity who sought to be adored for her personality, while Elizabeth was a monarch who sought to be respected for her duty. To Elizabeth, being heavy-going or boring was a shield that protected the crown from the volatility of public opinion. Yet, despite Jackie's harsh words, there was a strange obsession in the way she spoke about the Queen. She seemed haunted by the very stability she mocked. While Jackie's life was a whirlwind of political scandals, private grief, and public performance, Elizabeth was the anchor of an empire. Jackie's insults were perhaps less about the Queen's lack of intelligence and more about Jackie's own inability to find peace in her role as First Lady. She was a royal loyalist one moment and a devastating barb thrower the next, trapped in a cycle of self-pity and performative grace. As the story of their rivalry began to leak into the corridors of power, rumors started to swirl that this personality clash was doing more than just hurting feelings. It was shifting the tectonic plates of international relations. People began to wonder, could a First Lady's insult actually change the course of the Cold War? As Jackie continued to trash the palace in private, the Queen was preparing a response that would take her thousands of miles away to a place no one expected. For decades, a tantalizing theory has simmered in the halls of history. Did the friction between these two women actually steer the course of the Cold War? The narrative, often fueled by modern dramatizations, suggests that Queen Elizabeth was so rattled by Jackie's global victory in the theater of charm that she felt compelled to stage a counteroffensive. The idea is that Elizabeth, stung by Jackie's insults and her command of the world stage, decided to prove her own relevance by embarking on a high-stakes, dangerous diplomatic mission to Ghana. It's a compelling story. The Queen of England trying to even the scales with a girl from Newport, but the reality is far more complex and perhaps even more fascinating. The theory hinges on the Queen's 1961 visit to Ghana, a nation that was then drifting toward the Soviet sphere of influence under President Kwame Nkrumah. According to the rumor mill, Elizabeth was eager to show Jackie that while a First Lady could win over a French president with a wardrobe of Givenchy, a queen could hold together a crumbling empire through sheer force of will and tradition. It paints the Ghana trip as a reactionary clapback to Jackie's Parisian triumph. If Jackie was the new face of Western soft power, Elizabeth wanted to remind the world that the old guard still held the keys to the Commonwealth. However, historians like Carolyn Harris argue that this rivalry as policy narrative is largely a product of our obsession with female competition. While the timing of the Ghana trip followed the London dinner, the gears of British diplomacy moved far slower than a personal grudge. The Queen had taken her role as head of the Commonwealth with a seriousness that bordered on the sacred since her coronation. The mission to Ghana wasn't about outshining a socialite. It was about preventing the total collapse of British influence in Africa. The security concerns were real. Bombs had recently exploded in the capital, but Elizabeth refused to cancel, not because she was jealous of Jackie, but because she was the Queen. This disconnect between the rivalry and the reality highlights a fundamental truth about how we view these women. We often want to reduce their lives to a catfight over hairstyles and guest lists, but the stakes they were playing for were survival and legacy. Jackie was fighting for her identity in a world that saw her only as an accessory to her husband. while Elizabeth was fighting to keep a 1,000-year-old institution from fading into irrelevance. The true drama wasn't in the insults Jackie whispered to Gore Vidal. It was in the silent, grinding machinery of two different kinds of power colliding in the mid-Atlantic. Yet the shadow of Jackie remained. Even if the Queen wasn't consciously trying to get back at the First Lady, the world was now comparing them. Every move Elizabeth made was viewed through the lens of Jackie's modern elegance. The Queen was no longer just the sovereign. She was a woman being measured against the ultimate 20th century icon. This pressure created a crucible that would eventually lead to one of the most iconic moments in royal history. A moment that would prove that the heavy-going Queen had a few tricks of her own that Jackie Kennedy could never replicate. When Queen Elizabeth finally arrived in Ghana, the world held its breath. This was a country on the brink of a radical shift, and the British government was terrified that their monarch was walking into a trap. But as she stepped off the plane, Elizabeth wasn't thinking about Jackie's critiques of her wardrobe or the dilapidated state of her palace. She was entering a different kind of theater. While Jackie used her fluency in French and her knowledge of art to navigate European salons, Elizabeth used the ancient language of duty and symbolic gesture to navigate a changing world. The climax of the visit came at a grand banquet in Accra. In a move that shocked the diplomatic corps and signaled a tectonic shift in race relations and colonial politics, the Queen took the floor to dance with President Kwame Nkrumah. This wasn't just a social courtesy, it was a profound political statement. In 1961, a white monarch dancing with a black revolutionary leader was an image that radiated across the globe. It did more for British-African relations than 1,000 white papers or state dinners ever could. It was a moment of pure, raw leadership that transcended the superficial world of celebrity. Contrast this with Jackie's approach to influence. Jackie's power was personal. It was based on her formidable appearance, her wit, and her ability to make world leaders feel like they were the only person in the room. It was a power of the moment, ephemeral and tied to her physical presence. Elizabeth's power, on the other hand, was institutional. When she danced with Nkrumah, she wasn't just Elizabeth Windsor, she was the crown. She was using 1,000 years of history to bless a new nation's future. It was a move Jackie Kennedy, for all her brilliance, could never have pulled off because Jackie didn't represent an institution. She represented herself. The success of the Ghana tour was undeniable. It proved that the Queen was not incurious or unintelligent, as Jackie had claimed, but rather a master of a very specific, very difficult craft, the art of the long game. While Jackie was busy trashing the Queen's hair and the palace's furniture, Elizabeth was effectively saving the Commonwealth from a catastrophic fracture. It was a subtle, crushing rebuttal to the idea that the monarchy was a tired institution. Elizabeth showed that tradition wasn't a cage. It was a tool, and she knew exactly how to use it. This brings us to the ultimate irony of their supposed feud. Jackie looked at the Queen and saw a woman who was a dud, a relic of a dying age. But she failed to see the immense steel beneath the surface. The Queen's craftiness, the very thing Jackie had mocked, was what allowed her to survive while the Kennedy era would soon be shattered by tragedy. Jackie was a star that burned with incredible intensity, but Elizabeth was the North Star, fixed, constant, and unbothered by the passing clouds of social critique. The rivalry, whether real or imagined, reveals a deep truth about the nature of 20th century womanhood. One woman chose to be a revolutionary of style and intellect, challenging the boundaries of what a political wife could be. The other chose to be a guardian of continuity, sacrificing her personal opinions and even her humanity to serve a higher purpose. They were two halves of a whole, and as history moved forward, the world would realize that it needed both the Queen of Hearts and the Queen of the Realm to navigate the chaos of the modern age. 9 months after the initial disaster at Buckingham Palace, the narrative took an unexpected turn. In March 1962, Jackie Kennedy returned to London, but this time, the circumstances were different. She was traveling alone, fresh off a high-stakes, highly successful solo tour of India and Pakistan, where she had been treated like a visiting head of state. This was no longer the anxious, nail-biting woman who had felt like a dud in 1961. This was a refined, battle-hardened diplomat in her own right. She requested an audience with the Queen, and surprisingly, the invitation for a private lunch at the palace was extended. The world watched, wondering if the second meeting would result in more daggers or a genuine truce. Was this a genuine change of heart, or was it the ultimate performance? By 1962, Jackie had mastered the art of saving oneself, the very craft the Queen had mentioned a year prior. She had realized that being a royal loyalist in public was far more beneficial than being a critic. She had seen how the Queen's stoicism provided a sense of security that her own husband's volatile political world lacked. Perhaps in the quiet of that lunch, Jackie saw not a heavy-going monarch, but a woman who was the only other person on the planet who understood the crushing weight of a global spotlight. It was a moment of growth for Jackie, a transition from a socialite seeking validation to a stateswoman protecting an alliance. Yet, despite the public pleasantries, the whispers of their earlier feud refused to die. Historians still debate whether Jackie's second visit was a calculated move to smooth over the diplomatic tiff caused by her earlier remarks. The British press remained protective of their queen, and the American public remained obsessed with their First Lady. The rivalry had become a permanent fixture of their shared mythos, a shadow that followed them even as they tried to move past it. But as Jackie flew back to Washington, she couldn't have known that her newfound respect for the Queen's stability would soon be tested by a tragedy that would rewrite the history of the 20th century. But before the world changed forever, one final question lingered. Had Elizabeth actually forgiven the woman who called her unremarkable? Or was she simply waiting for the right moment to show Jackie what true power looked like? On November 22, 1963, the world stopped. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas didn't just end a presidency, it destroyed the Camelot that Jackie had worked so hard to build. In the wake of the tragedy, the petty insults of 1961 and the fashion critiques of the London social scene suddenly seemed like echoes from a different lifetime. In London, Queen Elizabeth II did something unprecedented. Breaking centuries of royal protocol, she ordered the bell of Westminster Abbey to toll for a foreign head of state. It was a gesture of profound respect that signaled the end of any perceived rivalry. The heavy-going Queen was the first to extend a hand of symbolic solidarity to the widow in the blood-stained pink suit. The aftermath of the assassination saw a complete reversal of the power dynamic. Jackie was no longer the triumphant icon of modern America. She was a woman drowning in grief, searching for a way to anchor her husband's legacy. Elizabeth, meanwhile, remained the immovable object, the steady hand in a world that felt like it was falling apart. In 1965, the Queen took another extraordinary step by dedicating a memorial to JFK at Runnymede, the very site where the Magna Carta was signed. Standing beside Jackie and the Kennedy children, the Queen spoke of her deep and lasting friendship with the late president. The woman Jackie had called incurious was now the primary architect of her husband's eternal memory in the United Kingdom. This period revealed the true nature of their relationship. It wasn't about who had the better hairstyle or who spoke better French. It was about the shared burden of being a female symbol in a male-dominated world. As they stood together at Runnymede, the contrast was stark. Jackie, hidden behind large black sunglasses, was a ghost of her former self, while Elizabeth stood as the embodiment of continuity. The Queen's craftiness, her ability to save herself and her institution, had allowed her to survive the 1960s, while Jackie's world had been systematically dismantled. The sad, dilapidated palace that Jackie had mocked was still standing, while the new frontier had ended in a motorcade. In the years that followed, Jackie's life would take turns that even the most imaginative tabloid writers couldn't have predicted. Her marriage to Aristotle Onassis would shock the world and distance her even further from the regal image she had once cultivated. Through it all, the Queen remained a constant, silent observer from across the Atlantic. There were no more insults, no more barbs about Commonwealth ministers of agriculture. The rivalry had been buried in the soil of Runnymede, replaced by a quiet, mutual understanding. They were survivors of a decade that had chewed up and spat out almost everyone else. Looking back, the feud between Jackie and Elizabeth serves as a perfect mirror for the era itself, a transition from the rigid traditions of the past to the volatile celebrity culture of the future. Jackie had tried to modernize the world through style and intellect, but she found that style was a fragile shield against reality. Elizabeth had maintained the world through duty and silence, finding that while silence might be boring, it was also indestructible. The woman who had once dismissed the Queen as unintelligent eventually had to reckon with the fact that the Queen's intelligence was of a different, more durable kind. As the 20th century marched toward its end, the vibrant, jagged energy of the 1960s began to settle into the amber of history. Jackie Kennedy, now Jackie Onassis, had transformed herself once again. After the chaos of her second marriage and the relentless hounding of the paparazzi, she found a strange kind of peace in the hushed, intellectual corridors of New York publishing. She had become an editor, a woman who lived among books and ideas, the very curiosity she once accused the Queen of lacking. Yet, in this final chapter of her life, Jackie seemed to adopt a touch of the Queen's own playbook. She became increasingly private, protecting her image with a stoic silence that mirrored the walls of Buckingham Palace. She had learned, finally, that the most powerful thing a woman in the spotlight can do is remain a mystery. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Queen Elizabeth II remained the one constant in a world of radical change. She watched as empires fell, technology reinvented human connection, and the very concept of royalty was questioned by a skeptical public. Through every crisis, the decolonization of Africa, the economic strikes of the 70s, and the internal scandals of her own children, she never wavered. The craftiness she had whispered about to Jackie in 1961 had become her greatest weapon. She didn't need to be the most interesting person in the room, she needed to be the most permanent. While Jackie's life was a series of dramatic reinventions, Elizabeth's life was a single, unbroken line of duty. When we look back at Jackie's scathing critiques from that first meeting, we see the irony of time. Jackie had called the palace a tired institution, yet it outlasted almost every political movement she had championed. She had called the Queen unremarkable. Yet the world would eventually realize that Elizabeth's unremarkable nature was a deliberate, heroic sacrifice of the self. Jackie was a shooting star, brilliant, blinding, and brief. Elizabeth was the sun, consistent, distant, and essential. The rivalry between them was never really about a guest list or a hairstyle. It was a clash between the temporary power of celebrity and the eternal power of sovereignty. In her final years, Jackie rarely spoke of the Queen, but when she did, the daggers were gone. She had come to realize that the good horse comment wasn't a sign of a small mind, but a sign of a woman who found beauty in the simple and the stable. Jackie had spent her life chasing the intellectual and the avant-garde, only to find that those things often led to heartbreak and instability. In the end, the two women represented the two paths of modern womanhood, the right to define oneself and the duty to represent something larger than oneself. They were the bookends of a century, two icons who defined power in ways that continue to haunt our imagination. The tragedy is that they could never truly be friends. Their roles wouldn't allow it. To be the First Lady of the United States was to be a performer on a shifting stage. To be the Queen of the United Kingdom was to be the stage itself. Jackie lived for the moment. Elizabeth lived for the ages. But as the curtain began to fall on Jackie's life in the early 90s, the world saw one final silent acknowledgement of their shared history, a respect that didn't need words, and a legacy that would ensure neither woman would ever be forgotten. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis passed away in 1994, leaving behind a legacy of grace, tragedy, and a style that remains the gold standard for American leadership. She died as she lived, an enigma who had survived the highest peaks and the lowest valleys of the human experience. Queen Elizabeth II continued her reign for nearly 3 decades more, becoming the longest reigning monarch in British history before her passing in 2022. When she died, the world felt the loss of the last great constant. The heavy-going queen had become the grandmother of the world, her silence eventually becoming her most respected attribute. The story of their rivalry is more than just gossip. It is a meditation on the cost of power. Jackie paid for her influence with her privacy and her peace of mind. Elizabeth paid for her crown with her personality and her freedom. They were 2 women born into a world that wanted to pit them against each other. Yet they both navigated that world with a dignity that few could ever hope to match. One showed us how to dream. The other showed us how to endure. In the end, history didn't choose a winner between the First Lady and the Queen. It gave them both immortality. The special relationship between their nations was mirrored in their own complicated bond, a mix of admiration, jealousy, respect, and profound misunderstanding. They were the most famous women of their time, yet they were perhaps the only 2 people who truly understood the loneliness of the pedestal they stood upon. Today, their names are synonymous with an era of elegance that feels increasingly distant. A reminder of a time when the world was changed by a dinner party at Buckingham Palace and a dance in Accra. Whose legacy resonates more with you? Was it Jackie's bold intellectual reinvention of the First Lady, or was it the Queen's unwavering, quiet devotion to duty? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. History is always better when it's a conversation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden rivalries of the 20th century, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're constantly uncovering the stories that didn't make the history books, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter. 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 See you in